All right. Well, good evening, good friends, and welcome to Loyola University of Chicago, a special place for teaching, learning, dialogue, and prayer, and service, I hasten to add, located here on the banks of the majestic, I always say, but this time I'm going to add something new, the majestic and the mysterious Lake Michigan. So I'm so glad you all came out tonight. And my name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. And on behalf of our Hank Center staff, Katie Arnold, our excellent center manager, Joe Vukov's home, yeah, good. Katie's fan club in the back there. Joe Vukov's our associate director, he's home tonight. Julian Sieber, graduate student, he's home tonight. Our intrepid undergrads are here, Vincent, Emily, and Matthew. And I'm so glad that our Team Rambler Productions undergraduate led but mentored by Professor Vince Singleton, who's here tonight. Thanks, Rambler Productions, for all you do. And then on behalf of Joan and Bill Hank and their family, whose generous endowment funds our many endeavors, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual, we're calling the Catholic Imaginations lecture, featuring Father Kevin Burke from Regis University. Father Burke is calling his lecture tonight, Something More, Denise Levertov and the Poetry of Transformation. Levertov is our subject, and the last time we had Father Burke here at Loyola was just about 10 years ago in October of 2015 for an amazing international conference on Denise Levertov. That Denise Levertov, who lived 1923 to 97, was one of the most pioneering and skilled poets of her generation, is beyond dispute. Her masterly use of language, innovative experimentations with organic form, and the political acuity disclosed by her activist poetry are well marked by critical communities. But it is also clear that the poems Levertov wrote, maybe all the way through, but certainly the last 20 years of her life, with her more explicit focus on religious and theological themes and subjects, are the best poetry on a religious experience of any century. Let's see here, where was I? Yes. We collected these essays from the conference, and my colleague and I, Missy Bradshaw and I, we put them in this volume, which is available for free if you're going to read it, at the desk. We have 30 or 35 copies. And I'm glad to see that Mary Gordon is here. Welcome, Mary. Mary has a great essay here. Kevin has an essay in here. Mary's has a fun title, Denise Levertov and the Uses of Outrage. So it's good stuff, and Kevin's got one in there. I have a couple in there. So these essays really are trying to get after the neglected aspect of Levertov's studies so as to expand and enrich the scope of critical engagement, honoring immanence, the interior life, exploring transcendence and poetic form, and dwelling with integrity in the spaces between. That's a serious enterprise, and it will take more than a lecture here on Thursday night to inhabit the possibilities, and that's why you should join us for a retreat this Saturday at St. Gregory Hall. We're calling it Annunciations, an Advent retreat on the poetry of Denise Levertov. Kevin Burke will lead, and Mark Franzen from St. Gregory Hall, which is a great center on arts and culture over in West Edgewater, Mark is hosting. The retreat is free, and all are welcome. Just a quick-ish biographical word about Kevin before we begin. Father Kevin F. Burke of the Society of Jesus grew up in Wyoming from a ranching family, and after entering the Society of Jesus, taught at Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, before becoming dean of the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, where I met Kevin many years ago. He currently serves as professor of theology and vice president of University Mission at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. Kevin is the author of 7 books, including the first full-length examination of the liberation theology of the Salvadoran Jesuit martyr Ignacio Ellacuría, also a Jesuit, and of blessed memory. Kevin is currently, surprise, completing a book tentatively entitled Opening the Doors of the World, Theology in the Poetry of Denise Levertov. Kevin's lecture goes about 45 minutes. We will then open it up to your responses. We're so glad you're here. And with that, we ask Kevin to the podium and welcome him and say, take it away, Kevin.
Michael, thank you. That was great. And thank you all for being here. It's great to see you and to be with you. So Michael has already said a little bit about Denise Levertov, and he implied that she's one of our great ones. I find myself from time to time thinking, when it comes to language, she's a Mozart. With poetry, she's a Picasso. She's an innovator, and she's someone who goes to the depths. I think she's really an amazing woman. She published over a period of about 50 years, close to 1,000 poems in 19 volumes. The collected works is a brick and a little bit too big on the plane to just do show and tell, but it's big. But our attention is fragile, right? It's flimsy, and we forget. And then we forget that we've forgotten. And we've got a kind of a cultural Alzheimer's that renders us passive, almost beyond the reach of voices like hers and other powerful voices that could lift us up at a time we need to be lifted up. So what I try to do is to say that we need her voice, her poetry, more than ever. And I'll break these remarks into 3 parts, entitling the first part, A Poet in the World. And let me just see if I can advance the slides. They'll be on the 2 sides. So the first part, this is the overall theme, A Poet in the World. I begin with a sketch of her passage through time. The title that she gave to her first book of critical essays was A Poet in the World. And I want to start with a look at her family of origin. She was born Priscilla Denise Levertov, with 2 F's at the end of that. And there she is in all of her glory, held by one of her dad's altar servers. Her father, Paul Philip Levertov, was born a Hasidic Jew in Russia, and he was brilliant, first of all. At college in Königsberg, he came across the New Testament in Hebrew and found the Messiah. He always thought of himself as a Jew. He never thought of himself as having left the Jewish world, although there were plenty of Jews who would contest that. That's not an easy thing. But he met and married Denise's mother, Beatrice Spooner-Jones Levertov, who was from Wales, an orphan. They met in Istanbul and were married. And the year before Denise was born in 1923, her father was ordained an Anglican priest. So she grew up in a pastor's household. She had one older sister, Olga, 9 years older than she, who's a story all of her own, somewhat troubled life, but Denise has some amazing poetry about her sister. So here she is at a younger age, right after publishing her first book, just after the Second World War, in 1946. She's 23 years old. Denise had never gone to school outside the home. Her entire education was through books, museums, and these brilliant parents that she had, and this amazing older sister. So the only credentials she ever had were her poetry. She taught at a number of universities. The only degrees that she ever had were all the honorary doctorates that she got from different schools. She taught at Stanford towards the end of her life, and that's a really important part of her story. But then she met and married and came to the United States and became a U.S. citizen in the mid-50s. And books 2 through 7 were published in about a 7 or 8 year period, 10 years after her first book. But then came the Vietnam War. And this is Denise in her mid-40s. I actually have grown to really like this photo. She was feisty. She was an activist. She was arrested several times for her protests against the war. Her husband was in a whole lot of trouble as one of the Boston Five on federal trial of, violating federal law and being against the draft. All her life, she never stopped being, quote unquote, political. For the rest of her life, she vigorously supported especially the cause of peace, but also racial and social justice and environmental sanity long before the ecological movement took off. She's really one of our great political poets. But the final major phase of Denise's career began when she was in her mid-50s. Her marriage had ended. Her mother, who lived all the way to 93, had died in Mexico. And she hadn't been attending church for 30 years. She thought of herself, the phrase spiritual but not religious had not yet been coined and popularized, but that would have fit her. She was a serious seeker. She wasn't spiritually lazy, but she just didn't know what to do with formal religious doctrines. She started to slowly reawaken to religious faith, and in the act of writing a poem, which she was going to originally call an agnostic mass, but published under the title A Mass for the Day of St. Thomas Didymus. Doubting Thomas, her patron saint, I think. A decade after writing this poem, she was awakening to faith, and she moved to Seattle. This was taken in her home in Seattle when she was in her late 60s. She died at the age of 74 of cancer in 1997, right before Christmas. But she started going to a Catholic church down the street, St. Edward's, and she kind of felt like she was being on the fence, not really committed to anywhere. And since she didn't drive and since it was hard to get to church, she just decided to become a Catholic. And then some of her friends introduced her to the Jesuit parish about 20 minutes away, and that became her spiritual home, St. Joseph's in Seattle. She got to know the Jesuits there. I've spoken with two of them who knew her well, Craig Boley and Lee Kapfer. At the age of 70, she made the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius as a 19th annotated retreat under the direction of Lee. She says in an interview, she didn't learn how to use imagination from Ignatius. She discovered that she'd always been using her imagination the way he suggests. And she kind of postulated maybe that's how God got to me. That's how faith reemerged in her life. So, a second theme, the more that there is. This is a line from the poem that gives the title to this talk, Something More. One of the human gifts that enabled Denise Levertov to become such a great poet was her gift for attention. She had that powerful attention to the details of life, to what Hopkins calls the inscape, not only of things, but of relationships and of movement, of things that are going on. That gift, she said, was nourished above all by her mother. And then she talks about the importance of attention, the discipline of attentiveness in various poems, and in some of her critical essays. And at the same time, inattentiveness for her is not a small foible, but something of a primordial betrayal of our vocation to be human beings fully alive. She's very, very sensitive to that, and she has poems about her own, at times, inattentiveness. We see her exercising careful attention and curiosity in a poem that depicts in words the uncanny experience that characterized her religious reawakening, the awakening that ushered her into the final phase of her poetic life. She never uses the word peace in this poem, but peace is part of the poem's theme because the title comes from a quotation in the King James translation of St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, where St. Paul writes, "And the peace of God that passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." Here is her poem that passeth all understanding. An awe so quiet, I don't know when it began. A gratitude had begun to sing in me. Was there some moment dividing song from no song? When does dewfall begin? When does night fold its arms over our hearts to cherish them? When is daybreak? Do you notice how the temporal dimension of faith suffuses this entire poem? In a series of nearly imperceptible movements, an awe that begins without notice, a gratitude that breaks into singing, and the question, was there some moment dividing song from no song? Here, the temporality of the human, the reality of life lived in time, the gift, we don't always see it as a gift, but the gift that time passes, receives explicit affirmation. Within the transience of the temporal, what is real appears as real without losing the aura of mystery. Here, Levertov frames the temporal dimension in a series of time-sensitive when questions. When does dewfall begin? When does night? When is daybreak? Although she can't see or grasp or freeze her movement through time, she perceives that she has moved. She understands that she is changing. And she affirms what she has intimated. But she bears this affirmation that the weighty reality of faith has touched and taken a hold of her on featherweight, fragile, temporal questions. And in so doing, she invokes the peace that the poets must imagine, the peace that Zechariah speaks about when he says, "The dawn from on high shall break upon us to guide our feet into the way of peace," the peace that moved St. Paul beyond all understanding. Such peace as divine gift, moves through time, passes through our lives, passing not as something to be grasped, but rather to be lived, to be affirmed. Most importantly, she infers that as with faith, we don't grasp peace. Peace finally grasps us. When is daybreak? When is daybreak? For Denise, the turn to religious faith later in her life was not motivated by weakness or fear or any kind of intellectual laziness. A number of her friends thought she had lost her mind when she became a Catholic. That just was a bridge too far. But it was the opposite. She was a God wrestler, in the words of her friend and fellow poet, David Shattuck. My point is this: the experience of mystery and the incapacity to encounter and wrestle with mystery most distinguishes us as human beings. And the exercise of that capacity enables us to be human beings fully alive. In her beautiful essay, A Poet's View, she writes, "This acknowledgement, the celebration of mystery, probably constitutes the most consistent theme of my poetry from the very beginning." This appears explicitly in the late poem from which I've taken the title for this talk, Something More. Here are the first 13 lines of this 26-line poem. Sometimes I'd make a Valentine's, long ago, a wilder place than it was. The sluice where a man-made lake spilled into Cranbrook, perceived as a cascade, huge in mesmeric power. I'd lean my arms on the rustic fence and gaze myself into almost trance. And now, leaving my 6th decade, I attribute sometimes the freedom and sly charm of the mountain rills and whales, to the tiny stream that playfully runs past the ponds at the hatchery, forming miniature falls before, through stonework channels built in the 30s, it passes under the road and joins the lake. The poem begins in a park called Valentine's, just a block or two from the home where she grew up. She spent a lot of time there, and Valentine shows up in a number of her poems. It begins with the realization that the power of memory, infused by imagination, could transform that place into a wilder place than it was. And likewise, the sluice, where a man-made lake spilled into Cranbrook, a little stream that ran through the park, it became like a hypnotizing waterfall. Even as a woman nearing the age of 70, she was leaving her 7th decade, but she wasn't very good at math. She was starting her 8th decade, but she didn't want to think about that. Even as a woman nearing the age of 70, she could catch herself attributing, quote, the freedom and sly charm of the mountain rills in Wales to the tiny stream that playfully runs past the ponds at the hatchery near her new home in Seattle. Her theological meditation on her gazing herself into almost trance unfolds through the final 13 lines of this poem. Viciously sentimental, this habit would be, of vesting the commonplace in robes of glory, if I deceived myself a fraction more. But even in childhood, I knew the difference, saw with a double vision. And I found the custom gives, in time, new spirit to fact, or restores it. Places reveal, as it were, their longings, inherent dreams. With the will to see more than is there, one comes at moments to perceive the more that there is. From behind gray curtains of low expectation, it is drawn forth, resplendent. With the will to see more than is there, one comes at moments to perceive the more that there is. Something more. Something more. Levertov challenges herself and her own temptation to dress the commonplace in robes of glory. Viciously sentimental, she calls it, recognizing it's not just a name, but there's an emotional immaturity and a propensity for violence that can happen with nostalgia. But her gazing is not a form of pretending. She's not hopelessly romanticizing her current condition by dressing it in hazy robes of nostalgia. Rather, stitching the seams among the places she previously lived and where she lives now, she points to the larger reality of place, of being both airy and rooted, of belonging to it even though the restlessness of roads will continually beckon her beyond every place. In the ecstatic revelation with which Something More concludes, Levertov gives voice to the longings that found in her a Jewish Christian home decades after leaving London, Essex, Valentine's, and Cranbrook. With the will to see more that is there, one comes at moments to perceive the more that there is. She comes to perceive the something more of the world. And crucially, this happens in and through the world, her world, a world woven in time, of time, and memory, and names, and doors, a world mediated by imagination, poetry, and place. In one of her late poems, placed at the conclusion of her brilliant 1996 collection, Sands of the Well, Denise returns to this theme of attention and inattention, of mystery and primal wonder. The title of this poem, Primary Wonder. Days pass when I forget the mystery. Problems insoluble, problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber, along with a host of diversions, my courtiers wearing their colored clothes, cap and bells. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamor recedes. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. The opening stanza contains a confession, not only of an inattentiveness, but of oblivion, forgetfulness. Days pass when I forget the mystery. She's confessing that she violated her own fundamental injunction. Do not forget. Pay attention. She concedes that a host of diversions crowd out attention and prayer. Does anyone here ever experience that? It can sound like an excuse. The busyness of everyday life, with its endless streams of problems insoluble, makes it easy to be absent or to forget. But Levertov is not making excuses. Rather, she insinuates that to forget the mystery represents a primordial sin. Moreover, those courtiers wearing their colored clothes are her attendants. She hired them. She brought forgetfulness into her life. Sin is not only something wrong, but something willed. And then, the lightning strike of the offset seventh line marks the spot where the poem takes a decisive turn. And then, once more, the temporal shift indicated by those words augurs a dramatic shift as well. A new personage enters the action, somewhat implicitly, the quiet mystery. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. It's not her own action, but the interruption of grace, mystery becoming present, that reverses the deadening, disgraceful fall into willed forgetfulness. And with this shift, the second stanza moves unabashedly into prayer. Out of her thousands of poems, there's only a handful that are explicitly addressed to the divine, that we would say, that's a prayer. This is one of them. She makes a prayer, and it's a prayer of praise. It's a prayer of attention. It's a prayer of recognition. O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still hour by hour sustain it. In her telling, the root experience that folds into the transcendent dimension of faith, punctuated by what, for example, St. Ignatius of Loyola would call the exclamation of wonder, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one. It appears not as naive psychological projection, but the sheer recognition of a crucial anthropological constant, a fact about us human beings. We are wired for mystery. It's undeniable. That is undeniable. As such, the human project of responding to mystery through painting, dancing, composing or playing music, writing or reciting poetry, writing novels, telling stories, worshiping, praying, studying, analyzing, experimenting, erecting monuments, building a world, raising children, all the myriad ways human beings have apprehended and voiced primary wonder in primal speech need no longer be viewed as a contest among different ways of knowing, with clear winners and losers. Science and religion are no more enemies than mysticism and politics. Each works to express the ongoing human mystery that Levertov labored to share. So my last point. the mystical, the political, and the ecstatic. I don't know if you've noticed, but the photos are all by a friend of mine. Her name is Julia Prince, a religious sister with a doctorate in spirituality who works with migrants in California and does retreat work and is just an amazing human being and an amazing photographer. She also has an article on photography and mystery in the Levertov book. She was a part of that conference. Denise Levertov's political awakening began in the 60s, but the roots go back to her childhood, her unusual family upbringing, and more than anything else to the Vietnam War. It triggered her, and it made her aware of how we can tell structural, monstrous lies. And this is part of the world we're dealing with now. As her political turn morphed into an explicitly religious turn, it was very subtle, this transition. It's interesting to note she never left the political behind. It crucially shaped her way of being religious, which included being extraordinarily attentive to the political realities of our suffering world. At the same time, her spiritual awakening and her return to active religious practice seemed to deepen and in certain ways to soften in a positive way her ecstatic and political attentiveness, including her capacity for wonder, her deep respect for the arts, her capacity for insistent protest of politically motivated historical suffering. Levertov's mysticism lives in the stories of her life, her activism, her protests, her teaching, her work for a more just world, and in her poetic imagination and in her poetic images. So I want to conclude focusing on 3 poems. They were published posthumously in the last book she did, and the editors of that book tell us that unlike all of her other books up to that point, she didn't arrange it herself. She would have put the poems in a different order. There probably would have been a few more of them, and the book might have had a different title than This Great Unknowing. It's a brilliant book. But what's interesting is they're published chronologically to when she finished them. So the last 3 poems in the book, we have a good hunch, are the last 3 poems she ever wrote. The third to the last is a mystical poem. It's a poem about God. She has other poems that speak in poetic images about God or to God. In these poems, she doesn't attempt to imagine God in God's self, but God in relation to us. In this poem, she speaks of God as an old scholar, a little bit like her dad, or like the great founder of the Hasidic branch that her family came from, Shneur Salman of Loyola. It's hard not to imagine her remembering her father and her father's great-great-grandfather in this poem, which she entitles Moments of Joy. A scholar takes a room in the next street, the better to concentrate on his unending work, his word, his world. His grown children feel bereft. He comes and goes while they sleep. But at times it happens a son or daughter wakes in the dark and finds him sitting at the foot of the bed in the old rocker, sleepless, in his old coat, gazing into invisible distance, but clearly there to protect, as he had always done. Oops, I'm sorry. I went too fast. The child springs up and flings arms about him, presses a cheek to his temple, taking him by surprise, and exclaims, Abba, the old intimate name from the days of infancy. And the old scholar, the father, is deeply glad to be found. That's how it is, Lord. Sometimes you seek, and I find. That's how it is sometimes. She starts by speaking about a scholar, later calling him the old scholar, and then the father. But towards the end, of the poem, she addresses him in the second person as Lord and as you. The old intimate name from the days of infancy, Abba. And the poem ends with the word find, but the one who is found and deeply glad to be found is the one who seeks us. The old scholar, the father, searches and seeks. And most telling, the intimate links between absence and presence, losing and finding, in terms of feeling bereft and experiencing intense joy, she quietly names her lifelong experiences of ecstasy as moments of joy. Her second to the last poem that she wrote just before dying has to do with one whom she calls a saint. This is very much a political poem because it's addressed to a survivor of the Jewish Holocaust, the great Romanian Jewish poet, Paul Celan. Levertov's personal canon of saints says much about her way of being Catholic. You'll see in this poem. It's quite interesting. In a poem called Thinking About Paul Celan. And I don't know if you can see the sadness in his eyes, but he lost both of his parents in the Holocaust, and many other family members died in Auschwitz. He himself was in a work camp, and he wrote one of the most famous poems about the war almost immediately after the war, and he wrote in German. His life was difficult. And towards the end of her own life, Levertov renewed her attention to Celan. His poetry is not easy, and especially in English translation. He's pushing language to the edge, to the frontiers. But just weeks before she died, she addresses Paul Celan as Saint Celan, a saint to whom she could pray. As a Catholic Christian with profoundly Jewish sensibilities, a saint she must pray to. And so here's the poem, Thinking About Paul Celan. Saint Celan, stretched on the cross of survival, pray for us. You at last could endure no more, but we live and live blithe in a world where children kill children. We shake off the weight of our own exemption. We flourish. We exceed our allotted days. Saint Celan, pray for us that we receive at least a bruise, blue, unfading. We who accept survival. She grieves that Paul Celan lived his adult lives stretched on a cross of survival. And she sees that he at last could endure no more. She follows these observations with a simple petition, pray for us. Her sorrow and clarity of vision intensifies in the final petition, pray for us that we receive at least a bruise. She is begging for grace, for the help to remain human. And she's not asking just anyone, but this unique poet for whom survival meant the crucifixion of creation. She's not asking for herself alone, but for us, the endangered human family. She is afraid, for she sees that we live and live blithe in a world where children kill children. She feels the full impact of our human shame as we shake off the weight of our own exemption. Thinking about Paul Celan weaves the seamless, mystical political lines of Levertov's witness, her growing religious faith, her sacramental sensibility, and her Catholic practice of praying to the saints, her continuing protests of war, of political apathy and unlived life, of which one can die. Her canon of saints now includes Salon and appears Catholic in the original sense of that word, that is, embracing the whole of humanity. At the end of her journey, her prayer to Salon underscores the profound symmetry between her political turn and her late religious turn, and at the same time, her growing mystical vision refined and deepened her political poetry, leading her further into her vocation as a poet in the world. So, moments of joy, thinking about Paul Celan. Here's the last poem she finished, probably just weeks before she died. She entitles it, Aware. She opens this poem with a line very close to that, which is the title of the book that I've written about her, that is actually at the publisher now, and hopefully will appear sometime next year, called Opening the Doors of the World. She writes, "When I opened the door, I found the vine leaves speaking among themselves in abundant whispers. When I opened the door, how many doors did she open in her lives? Yeah, I mean, it's just a great question. And then she says, because she recognizes that she's an intruder as much as one who is part of the life of the vines, and she says, my presence made them hush their green breath, embarrassed, the way humans stand up, buttoning their jackets, acting as if they were leaving anyway, as if the conversation had ended just before you arrived. An insider and an outsider among the things of the world. That's the human curse. We're part of nature, and we stand over against nature. We need the world, and we're destroying the world. That is the human curse. Levertov perceived the deep connection among things. All reality shares its intelligibility and its pain. And meanwhile, in her final poem, she notices and appreciates the song of the world, the dance among living things, the drama of unspoken signs that speak. And she ends aware this way. I liked the glimpse I had, though, of their obscure gestures. I liked the sound of such private voices. Next time, I'll move like cautious sunlight, open the door by fractions, eavesdrop peacefully. The final word and the final line of the final poem in her last book. Peacefully. I could say much, much more about her lifelong work for peace, her very, very strong sense about the injustice and the horror of war and violence. But these final poems, Aware, Thinking about Paul Celan, and Moments of Joy, emerge from the heart of a life spent weaving the ecstatic, the political, and the religious threads of the human journey into one poetic destiny. These poems, indeed many of her late poems, bear us back to the peace and gentle rest with which she concludes that earlier poem, Mass for the Day of St. Thomas Didymus, the poem in which she practically wrote herself back into faith. These and all her poems invite us to take our cue from the vine leaves. Amen. So be it. Thank you. So conversation, it doesn't have to be questions. What kind of an expert am I? We're all experts in our humanity, so I'm interested in your ideas as much as any questions you might have.
I was going to say that the dialogical spirit is deep with Kevin, so that's exactly the way to go. I want to make one observation, director's privilege, I suppose, but it was so wonderful to see Julia's photos. It's a singular eye, and thanks very much for that.
She's pretty good, isn't she?
She's pretty good. She's got a future there. She's a wonderful person. But Kevin, you have the music in you, and the way you read poetry, her poetry was brilliant. And I remember when I first met Kevin, it was maybe 25 years ago. I think Kevin was just working on the essential writings of Pedro Arrupe for Orbis, and that's a book you got to read. And it was a Levertov presentation. You know, he's probably navigating his attention between the poet and a different kind of poet, Pedro Arrupe. But anyway, he was reading City Psalm, one of Levertov's most well-known works, and he had it to an instrumental version or a piece by Peter Gabriel from The Last Temptation of Christ. That was a pitch-perfect kind of choreography, and I love that, you know. And so I started kind of using that in my teaching, and the students really ate it up. So what ideas are alive with this team here?
Right here.
Just what a treat to have you speak the poems. I mean, they just came alive. I don't know how much she intended her poetry to be spoken, but I love what you did, speaking them.
She wanted poems to be read aloud before they were read. And I hesitate to put the words up, but I also know that sometimes you can miss something and be frustrated if a line drops and it's an important. So I try to go between the two. But she would say poetry should first of all be heard, should be spoken and heard. And she says, because we human beings sang before we spoke. And poetry is one of our oldest musics.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Other thoughts,
What's the old thing about singing, praying twice? Is that the old one there? Mary?
I'm just thinking about Denise and attention. Did she read Simone Weil on attention?
Yes, she did. Yeah. She was very interested in the mystics. And different ones grabbed her in different ways. The one that I'm most aware of is her kind of devotion to that great English Anglican mystic, Julian of Norwich. And she has a long poem in Breathing the Water that's taken from the showings of Julian. But she says in one interview, I'm not a mystic. But then she says in a letter to Adrian Rich, maybe it's the skeptic in you that's bothered by the mystic in me.
Mary's one of our most cherished writers, and I don't mean to embarrass you, Mary, but what do you think about the writer or the poet and the faculty of attention?
It's the center of everything, I think. And so Simone Weil talks about attention as the center of the relationship to God.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, what is interesting, I just looked at a show of Man Ray's, who I didn't think I was interested in, but he puts together just a bunch of paper clips and cufflinks and staples and things that you would not pay attention to, and pays attention. And I was just thinking, anything can be made of art if one attends to it closely enough. So.
Thomas Merton? I don't want to. Your book on Thomas Merton is quite good. That side of the room, Katie. Katie, thanks so much.
You spoke of the importance and centrality of mystery in her work and poetry. And so I wanted to ask how should I phrase it? But how do you understand mystery?
Well, I'm probably really influenced here by the German theologian Karl Rahner, for whom God is absolute mystery. That's one of his circumlocutions for God, because the word God has been so badly trampled. It can mean anything or nothing, whatever. And the problem with the word is that it's not pointing to anything, right? In other words, God is not a thing. God is not an object of our experience, right? So what Rahner's trying to get us to think is that God is the horizon of all of our experience, and the ground and the telos, the goal of our living and our experiencing. Now, does that fit with Levertov? This is the danger when you are yourself kind of a strong interpreter. You can happily read in. But I was interested to learn that Levertov actually picked up Karl Rahner's Foundations of Christian Faith. And with one of the Jesuit friends of hers at the parish where she was working her way through it. And the second chapter is on God as absolute mystery. Now, she wrote poems on mystery way earlier, and I actually had a quotation that I dropped out because I didn't want to go too long. But if I can find it real quickly, I'll read it to you. Let's see if I can find this. No, I'm probably not going to find it. She has this early poem where it's about a father and a son go into a forest, and they're met there by the tutelary spirit of the forest. And they seem to have this job to do, which is to pull this big chain out of the ground. And they can't do it. But what they discover was the whole point was to go into the forest, was to enter into the mystery. So Denise says in an interview, I think the central theme of my poetry all my life has been the experience of mystery. And that's why I found myself before I realized I was doing it, thinking about, yes, it's true, we have this experience, that experience, all of our different experiences. Religious experience isn't some kind of a special, occult, esoteric experience for certain special people who wear weird clothes. That religious experience is a part of every experience. The paper clips and the cufflinks you were just talking about can be the occasion of an encounter with mystery. And this is the point, is that mystery is a part of our reality. It's always there. And somehow we just don't avert to it. We don't spend enough time. We don't get quiet enough. We don't put our cell phones down often enough to pay attention to the reality that, as she says in Primary Wonder, not only is it a void, it's not a void. There's everything. There's music. There's children. I discovered that there's a South African praying mantis that's now in California. I took a picture of it. I took a picture of some tiny little ants against the rising sunrise, and they were all translucent. Who knew? They all carry the light, like their own little special lights. If we just pay attention, we begin to see that everything carries the all, the whole, the horizon, the one that's beyond all names. So yeah, there's Rahner in there. The other theologian who really helped me in writing this book, and who's the most important interlocutor in my Levertov conversation, was Rahner's student, Johann Baptist Metz, who was horrified to come out of the Second World War. Okay, Second World War, 1944, December, Battle of the Bulge, right? You remember your history? He's 16. He's the equivalent of a sophomore in high school, and he's drafted given like 3 weeks of training and sent to the front, and the Allies have already crossed the Rhine. I mean, the war is over from Germany's point of view, and I think we're going to say no. The machine is talking to me, so I need to take him. Metz had the experience being sent by his company commander to battalion headquarters with an urgent message. The urgent message is, what do we do now? And he never could find the battalion because they had moved. And so he goes back to his company, and they were all dead. His entire company, all these 16-year-old boys were dead. And he said, I walked through that field and looked at those faces, and out of that field emerged a silent cry. And behind that cry, all of my German Catholic socialization was swallowed up. And I needed to ask the question of God facing the cry. And the keynote of Metz's theology is the notion of dangerous memories, the importance of memory, and the recovery of the Jewish dimension of Christian faith. So I had a chance to talk with Johann Baptist Metz in his home in Münster about Denise Levertov, because I wanted to ask him about the relationship of theology and poetry, and he volunteered. Although he's never published any of his poetry, he'd been writing poetry all his life. And you can see it in his theology. He's so careful, every word. And he is troubled by Rahner's confidence that he can build a system that answers every question. And he wants us instead to face history. I think Metz and Levertov are like twins separated at birth. They were 5 years apart in age, but they are like kindred spirits. And entering into her poetry and then letting the poetry lead me, it led me back to Metz. But he too would speak about mystery. And Metz will ask this kind of a question. Do we believe in God? Or do we believe in what we think about God? And in that, really believe in ourselves. He's really pushing the questions very hard. And he's pushing the church to face its complicity in historical violence. He's asking the church to face Auschwitz. And he was the primary author of the German Bishops' Conference response to Vatican II. The German Synod of Bishops in 1974, it was 100 years ago last year, 50 years ago last year, the anniversary of the document Unsere Hoffnung, our hope. Our hope. So mystery is the doorway to our hope. That was a way long answer to a great question.
It was beautiful. I want to just offer also Jacques Maritain, coming from the neo-Thomist vein, who knew poetry and philosophy, and he distinguishes mystery from problem. Mm-hmm. Problems can be solved. Mysteries are inexhaustible, are deepened, they give life. Yeah. Simple, and that's in his preface to Metaphysics from 1963. Somebody else, a thought, going to push back? What does Levertov do with memory? Does she do poetry of memory at all?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, she doesn't write about memory. She remembers. So she has poetry about different things through her life, including poems about memories of her parents. She has a beautiful poem called Link, and it's about a memory that her mother told her about. When her mother, Beatrice Spooner Jones Levertov, was 5 years old in the 1880s, she was taken to meet her great uncle, who'd been a drummer boy at Waterloo. And he lived in a little fisherman's cottage on the edge of the ocean. He was like 85 years old. He had long beard and knee breeches and a dirt floor. And she's marveling that one person's life, her mother, links an age somewhere along the receding edges of the Middle Ages and the age of nuclear war. And she writes it in a poem. It's stunning. It's just, she has this capacity to just do memory. That's what I love about her work.
Time for 2 or 3 more. If you have anything you want to add or ask, don't be bashful.
Thanks so much. Just kind of a simple question. What were her poetic influences? Well, okay,
It's a great question.
I'll ask 2 questions because that one's easy. What were her poetic influences? And then going back to sort of her life, being involved with various forms of activism, and thinking about the interconnectedness of activism, political action, and mysticism. Mm-hmm. What was her particular take on the relationship between the two? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So an easy and a hard one.
Well, so the easy answer, actually, the question, because you asked what, one could take that all sorts of ways of like, well, all of her experiences, the things she encountered. But I also hear in your question the who. Who are the other poets or who are the people? And there are a lot of them. But I'll just mention a couple. Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, is very important. Pablo Neruda is important. And I think, and this is understudied in Levertov's studies, but I'm really convinced Gerard Manley Hopkins is critical. Thomas Merton was an important influence, but not so much as a poet, as a person. Daniel Berrigan, not a great poet, a great human being. And that's, I think, what Denise might have said. But the American who had the biggest influence on her was William Carlos Williams. And, there would be others, Robert Duncan, Robert Creeley, Charles Olson. But I think Williams was a key. And they became friends. And there's a small book of their correspondence. There's a huge book of her correspondence with Duncan. And the kind of tragic ending of their friendship over the way they responded to the Vietnam War. I mean, they were both against the war, but they had very different ways of being against it. He was horrified at her activism. And he said some pretty strong things that he wouldn't take back. He said them in print, and she was pretty offended. And so that friendship kind of went off the rails somewhat. But that other question about mysticism and politics, although she might not have used that trope, that would be one that Metz would use, or Gutierrez or other theologians might use, the mystical political. And it's a familiar trope to me. She's just doing that. But here's the interesting thing. In those years when she was first protesting the Vietnam War, there was, and I try to treat this in my book, she was stuck. One of the worst writing block periods of her entire life. She hadn't written a poem in 6 months. And she felt she had to write something about the war, but she couldn't write. And then this one day, out of the blue, she writes a poem about 2 angels. And she says it wasn't a dream, it was like a waking vision. She almost saw it. And these 2 angels are on the brink of fall from angelic nature because they're tempted to be jealous of each other's colors. But because that perfection called intellectual love flew into their wings, they didn't fall. And they could appreciate the otherness of the other. Anyway, an amazing poem. And immediately after writing that poem, she wrote the first of her Vietnam poems, Life at War. And she's convinced that there's a connection, but she says in an interview, I don't know what it is. I think they're somehow connected, but I don't know how that is. Well, I think she was in touch in a kind of an implicit way with that religious or transcendent dimension of life without necessarily using the language. She was grappling to find a way to say this, but then she got involved in the war and in the anti-war, and that became her politics was probably for a period there the way she expressed her faith. And she says in one of her most important anti-war poems, it's a long, long poem called To Stay Alive. She says, I was on the brink of being totally burned out. And she hears her childhood friend saying to her, Denise, get back into your well. Go deep into your well, as into a poem. And so I think Denise understood that she needed something to sustain her politics. She couldn't do it out of her ego. She couldn't do it out of her outrage. I think that's what I would call the mystical political. She didn't think about that in some kind of a theoretical way, the way maybe I have done as a theologian. She just did it. She integrated those. She wasn't always integrated. I've read articles by former students who said she could be a real bitch. I imagine she was pretty exacting in the classroom. I imagine my mother's twin sister, my indomitable Aunt Agnes. When I think about Denise Levertov, they would have been about the same age. But the point is, she changed over time. And there was a tenderness. Emily Warren, a poet up in Seattle, who became a very dear friend of Denise, who's Jewish by upbringing, but is a practicing Buddhist, said that Denise was one of the kindest and gentlest people she had ever met. So you get all these sides. I suppose all of our lives have some of that, right? She didn't have it all together. She will never be canonized a saint, but she's in my canon. She wrote this book. I didn't write it.
This is Mark Franz, and Mark, glad you're here. Mark's hosting our retreat at Direct St. Gregory Hall. If you want to go to the retreat on Saturday, be our guest. Thanks, Mark, for being host. Go into your well.
Go into your well.
That's going to stick with me.
I'm going to have to show you that line, that place. It's just really beautiful. Her childhood friend, Betty Mitchell, who shows up in a half dozen poems.
Got to see it. And I'm thinking like the freshest water at the bottom of the well.
Yeah.
You can inhabit that metaphor. That side of the room, we have time for one or two more if you want to have an intervention, a comment. It is not mandatory. Oh, there's one more. This Beatrice. Good to see you. Glad you're out tonight.
I just had a quick question. So if somebody wanted to start reading her work, is there like a specific place or a certain place that you think would be a good place to start?
That is a great question. Really a cool question. And, if you're interested in her religious poetry, she put together a small volume called The Stream and the Sapphire, Religious and Spiritual Poems. And it's a nice little book, and it's easy to put in your pocket or your purse or whatever. That's a nice place to start. There's a similar book of a similar size called This World Around Us, and it's her poems on nature and ecology. So both of those are beautiful. But I really like reading her poems in the books that she originally published them in, because then you get political poems and ecological poems and poems about how hard it is to be married or how hard it is when your kid is pissed off at you, right? Next to her poems about God or about, St. Peter and the angel. I really like that. So the book that I first started reading is one of her later. It has some of the spiritual religious poems, and it's called Breathing the Water. And I love that book. And you kind of get all of it, and it's not real long. I think the last book that she published before she died, called Sands of the Well, several of the poems I read are from Sands of the Well. And it's an astonishing book. But you can also find her online. You can just, if there's something, like if you want to do Denise Levertov and mystery, some stuff's going to come up. There are a lot of blogs. I want to find all these bloggers. I want to Google them and I want to tell them about my book. But no, there's all kinds of people who have written, and some of them really intelligent, really thoughtful meditations. You know, Anglican priests from New Zealand. And I mean, there's a world out there and it's interconnected. It's so strange. So, yeah, that's a really cool question. But if I were, I had a friend who wanted to give the book to his a book by Denise to his daughter. So I recommended Breathing the Water.
Thanks. Beatrice is an undergraduate, and Amy, you can ask your question. But undergraduates in here, I have copies of The Stream and Sapphire, and if you email me, I will give you one gratis, so you can find your way to Denise Levertov. The last question is from Amy Alsnauer. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and I'll be at your retreat tomorrow.
Good.
Or not
On
tomorrow,
Saturday.
Saturday. Two questions. One, do you have, this is just quick, but do you have the reference for that Metz
Quotation.
meditation on the battlefield?
Yeah, so there's a book in English called A Passion for God,
Okay.
translated by actually a very good friend of mine, Matthew Ashley. And Metz wrote a kind of a preface for that book. It's 10 of his essays, including 2 on Rahner, a beautiful essay called A Passion for God, a powerful essay called Theology as Theodicy. And at the preface, he tells that story. It's actually not a preface. He calls it a note on my intellectual itinerary or something like that. But, it's at the beginning of the book. That's where you'll find it. Passion for God,
Okay.
Paulus Press, 1999.
Wow. Thank you.
That's how you're really a sick person.
Easy bib right there.
So my
You're
second
like
question,
AI.
Yeah.
You memorize footnotes, right?
Chat GPT SJ.
My second question was just about your own, sort of a double question, how you came to Levertov. And then with that, as you were speaking so movingly about her poetry and then speaking about images that you came across, like those translucent ants, I just wondered, do you write poetry?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been writing it since high school, on and off, but I never knew when a poem was done until I started reading Levertov. And then read her critical essays. I kind of took her course. And her essay on line breaks and breathing and how to get the rhythm of the poem right. And then little by little I began to see the poem is finished when it abandons you. That's actually, I'm stealing that thought from Paul Valéry. But but you had another part of that question, which I loved. What was the first part of that second question?
How you came to...
Yeah. So it began with a woman named Christina Stevens, who's an amazing human being. And she was doing an MDiv at Weston School of Theology in Cambridge while raising 2 boys up in Orono, Maine. She was driving for a couple days a week, would arrange her schedule to do an MDiv while raising a family. And she became a hospital chaplain, and she's been training hospital chaplains at St. Louis University Hospital for years now. Amazing woman. She came to me one day, we became friends, and I was writing my dissertation. I was steeped in Xavier Zubiri, Ignacio Echevarria, John Sobrino. She said, Kevin, you need to be reading something besides philosophy and theology. Have you ever heard of this poet? And she gave me Breathing the Water, Sands of the Well, and Oblique Prayers, 3 books. And I had them for the better part of that year, and I can find traces of how it was starting to get into me in my own journal. And my own poetry began to emerge out of my journaling and out of prayer. I had to give the books back because she was graduating in May. I finished my dissertation that fall, or late that summer, and then started teaching at Weston that fall. It was a crazy year. My mother died that spring. It was just an intense time. And I needed to publish that dissertation if I was going to be a serious theologian, right? 3 years later, in 2000, I didn't even know this, but Denise had died in the meantime. And another friend in a bookstore in Philadelphia called out a question. I was looking at the theology and philosophy. She was looking at the poetry. She said, "Hey, Kevin, do you know this poet?" She was holding a book by Denise Levertov. That night I bought for myself several of those books, 3 or 4. And then within about 2 or 3 years, I had maybe 10 of her books of poetry. Eventually, I had 16 of the 19 original volumes. And most of the early stuff can be found in a collected book. And the poems that aren't in there, I was able to get from the original text that my friend Al Jelpe. So Albert Jelpe, who Mike knows well. Albert and Barbara, okay, get this. Albert just turned 95. Barbara's going to turn 94 soon. And they're still living at home. They met Mitch and Denise in the early 60s when they were in graduate studies, doctoral studies at Harvard. And they were friends for all of those years. And it was because of Albert, who is the chair of the department at Stanford, that Denise started teaching at Stanford. And the last time she visited them, the summer before she died in December, she was in remission from the cancer that eventually took her life. But Barbara says she did a perfect 360-degree pirouette with absolute grace in our living room. I conflated that with Al's martinis, but it had nothing to do with the martini. They're the greatest couple. And they told me so many stories about her, and really is, and other people, Emily and other folks that I've gotten to meet through the years who met her. I never met her face to face. I lived 3 blocks from her for 3 years when I was in North Cambridge doing my first theology studies in the 1980s.
You had to have walked by her.
I lived on Mass Avenue, 2240 Mass Avenue, and she lived at 12 Glover Circle right around the corner. Well, if I met her, who knows, I might have. I probably didn't see her, and I definitely had no idea what I was missing.
Well, Al Jelby was my, there is one more question, Mary. Yeah, honestly, really quick before Mary goes. Al Jelby was my dissertation director. Barbara taught me, and then Donald Jelby is a great Jesuit who, of blessed.
He was the one who introduced me to Al and Barbara.
Amazing, and then that's how I met Denise as well. Mary.
I just had an idea about how mysticism and politics came, because it's irrational to keep being a political activist against the evidence of history. Mm-hmm. So the only way to stay politically active is through an act of faith, through some perception that there is something beyond the horizon, something more that is the only thing that keeps you going, because the evidence would tell you to lie down and put the covers over your head.
Yeah.
That was just my thought.
So well put. So well put.
How grateful we are to, thank you, Mary. How grateful to Denise Levertov.
Yeah.
And let's show our gratitude to Kevin. How grateful we are for him. Please be our guest. There's plenty of food here, students. Anybody, if you have bags, take stuff with you. Fruit. We like to see nothing go to waste. Thank you very much.